Hi everyone, welcome to today's network seminar. And today our speaker is Zachary Neal. Zach is currently an associate professor at Department of Psychology, Michigan State University. Zach has a background in philosophy with a bachelor's degree and sociology with master's and doctorate degrees. His work focuses on networks as both a theoretical perspective and quantitative approach for understanding human behavior at multiple scales. Let's welcome Zach. Please feel free to start.
Thank you, for the very nice introduction and for the invitation to join you. I'm happy to be here virtually. Before I begin, I'll just say if you have questions as I'm going, please feel free to interrupt me. It looks like if you're in person, you can put your hand up, sort of wave me down. But I've also got my Zoom chat window open if you're virtual. So if you have questions, feel free to type them in there. But I'll leave some time at the end so we can chat. But today I wanted to talk a bit about backbones of networks and specifically extracting backbones from bipartite projections. This is something I've been working on for a number of years. And most recently, I've been exploring different ways that we can extract these backbones and how different methods compare. So in today's talk, I'll be comparing sort of two different strategies, one using hard constraints and one using soft constraints. So just to get us started, quick review what I have in mind when I'm talking about a bipartite network. So bipartite networks, sometimes also called two-mode networks or affiliation networks, have two kinds of nodes. In the talk, I'm going to call these nodes agents and artifacts. If we represent this network as an incidence matrix, the agents are the ones in rows. These are the ones that we're actually going to be interested in our backbone, and the artifacts are listed in the columns. So a lot of my work using backbones looks at or applies it to empirical data on US congressional politics. So I'll use that as sort of a running example. Although US politics are just about as much a mess as UK politics. So I think a lot of the examples should translate reasonably well. So we can imagine a bipartite network of senators and the bills that they've sponsored. So for example, this little snippet of an incidence matrix shows Senators Booker and Warren as agents and Senate Bills 498 and 862 as artifacts. So you can see we could extend this many rows and many columns. And so in a bipartite network, edges connect agents to artifacts. In this example, we see both Booker and Warren sponsored Senate Bill 862. This was the Paycheck Fairness Act. But neither of them sponsored Senate Bill 498, the Constitutional Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which would have made it easier to carry concealed weapons. So from this, we can form a bipartite projection. So a bipartite projection converts our original bipartite network into a symmetric unipartite network. And in this network, in the projection, the nodes are the agents. So for example, a bipartite projection of this bill sponsorship data would give us something like a network of senators. And the edge weights in these bipartite projections capture the number of shared artifacts a pair of agents has. So in our example, we might observe, for instance, that Booker and Warren sponsored 98 of the same bills. The diagonal in a bipartite projection simply captures an agent's total number of artifacts. So in this example, we can see Booker sponsored a total of 261 bills in the session. Warren sponsored a total of 291 bills in the session. Although in practice, we're usually not particularly interested in the diagonal of the projection. And so we can generate from an incidence matrix, this unipartite adjacency matrix, simply multiplying the original bipartite times its transpose. So we see this process appear in many different domains applied to lots of different empirical types of data. Much of my work has applied it in cases where the bipartite network captures politicians sharing bills. But we also see this in geography, where cities share firms. We see it in business in the case of corporate interlocking directorates, where firms share directors. In commerce, where customers share or co-purchase products. In science, where authors share papers. In genetics, where genes are co-expressed. In food, this is sort of a fun paper where foods share flavors. Classic small world paper, we see actors sharing films. And in fact, many have suggested that any one mode network that we observe can in fact be conceptualized as a projection of some observed or unobserved bipartite network. So the upshot here is bipartite projections are incredibly common. And there are a number of different reasons that we might want to study bipartite projections. In my case, I find bipartite projections particularly helpful when we're interested in some unipartite network, but it would be impossible or impractical to actually measure that unipartite network directly. We need an indirect method of measurement. And there are lots of contexts where this might come up. So in the case of political networks, it would be very difficult to directly survey politicians, both because they're busy and because they may lie to us about where their actual alliances and antagonisms lie. There are many cases where we might be interested in a social network among children. They are notoriously difficult to survey, especially preschool age children, because they don't pay attention to surveys. They often can't fill out surveys, things like that. And certainly in economic geography, if we're interested in economic exchanges, say among cities or regions, that type of data at that level of aggregation is not always available. And so in each of these contexts and many others, bipartite projections offer us one way to use more readily collectible data to make some inferences about what some underlying unipartite network might actually look like. And so in these cases, we can try to infer an unobserved network we're actually interested in from a bipartite projection. Now, although I like studying bipartite projections, I think they're useful in lots of cases. There's a couple caveats that come with that. There are some reasons not to study bipartite projections. So the first reason this might not be a good idea is that this projection transformation going from the bipartite data to the unipartite data involves losing some information. So our projection is going to tell us how many artifacts two actors share, but it's not going to tell us which artifacts they share. So we get some counts of, say, for a pair of senators, the number of bills they sponsored together, but we're going to lose which bills those were. So because the projection function involves losing some data, we may not want to do that if we don't have to. And a number of techniques now exist to directly study bipartite networks. So if we're interested in network evolution, there are routines for bipartite stochastic actor-oriented models in the Siena package. If we're interested in cross-sectional networks, exponential random graphs have been extended to the bipartite case. And even if we're just looking to describe networks, there are bipartite versions of centrality and all sorts of other conventional network metrics. So here we just want to keep in mind, if we can study the original bipartite network, if our research question is answerable at that level, there's no need to move to a bipartite projection because we've already lost some information at that point. The second reason we might want to be cautious studying bipartite projections is that a projection allows us to convert any rectangular matrix of data into a square matrix. But that's a problem because not every square matrix makes sense to interpret as a network. And so when we make this transition from bipartite to unipartite, we need to have some sort of theory about why sharing artifacts or having co-occurrences or having overlaps tells us something about the relationships between actors. So this is a method, but it's a method that requires some theory for it to make sense. And so we generally don't want to study projections as social networks unless we've got some sort of theory about what sort of relationship that bipartite projection is actually measuring. But if we're interested in a one mode, a unipartite network, and we've got a good theory, then we can move forward with bipartite projections, and we have to figure out what to do then. So there's a couple problems with projections that make them tricky to study. So one possibility is we could just study our projection as an ordinary weighted network. The problem here is that interpreting the weights is sort of tricky. So if we take a look at our example, we observe that Booker and Warren sponsored 98 bills together. The problem is it's very difficult to evaluate is 98 a lot? Is it not very many? It's difficult to know what the scale is on that edge weight to decide, is this a large enough number to say Booker and Warren are working together on these bills or not? And it depends. It depends on some characteristics of the underlying bipartite data from which the projection was generated. And there's really two features that are particularly important here. So the first feature are the row sums. So in this context, the row sums are the total number of bills each of these senators sponsored. So we see in these data, Booker and Warren each sponsored quite a few bills. And so even if they were just choosing randomly, if Booker randomly chose 261 bills and Warren randomly chose 291 bills, the fact that they picked 98 of them, the same ones, may not be particularly surprising. And so we need to take into account whether they're each individually sponsoring lots of bills or not that many to contextualize whether this overlap of 98 is big. The other feature we need to consider are the column marginals. In this context, these sort of measure how popular the bills were, how many people sponsored each of these bills. So what we see is the bill that they did sponsor together, Senate Bill 862, this was the Paycheck Fairness Act, was not a particularly popular bill. So of the 100 senators in the US Senate, only 45 joined on and sponsored this. So it wasn't hugely popular, and yet they were willing to both stick their neck out for this bill. And so observing that they both stuck their neck out for the same unpopular bill may actually be fairly noteworthy. The fact that they shared that one maybe should, in some sense, count for more. And so the fact that they picked the same 98 bills may actually tell us something in this context. And so taking those two pieces of information into account, we can extract the backbone of a bipartite projection. So the backbone of a bipartite projection is a binary, unweighted network that aims to only keep the most important edges in the projection. So in the Congress case, we're trying to identify, say, pairs of senators that sponsored a noteworthily large number of bills together, a significantly large number of bills. The challenge here is we need some methods for deciding which edges are important. So there's lots of different ways that we could do this. And the method we use for deciding which edges are important makes a huge difference for the sort of network we get out the other end. So one possibility is we could just use the weighted network, use these raw edges, and treat stronger edges as more important. So in this case, I've just plotted the Senate network with weighted edges. And what we get here are really dense networks. And in this context, we see no particular community structure. It makes it look like Republicans and Democrats are sort of all getting along in this cluster. So another possibility is we could claim that stronger edges are more important edges, but we need to control for node degree. So here we can do something like extract the backbone using the disparity filter. So we can do this. Certainly the disparity filter works well for many weighted networks. The problem is when we apply it to bipartite projections, we wind up typically with very sparse networks, and we don't see much of a community structure. So certainly we've got a cluster of the blue Democrat nodes, and we've got a cluster of the red Republican nodes, but the network is so sparse that we're not really capturing the polarization that we know exists in the US Senate at this time. The final option, and this is the one I'll focus on, are using methods of backbone extraction that are really designed for bipartite projections. And so here we get a density that's somewhere in between these other options, but it much better preserves the community structure, the modularity that we know exists. So we see a strong, solid cluster of Republicans in red and a strong cluster of Democrats in blue. We could look up the names of these nodes in the middle, but these are senators that are typically known to the media, to political elites as bipartisan or flip-floppers or wishy-washy, that are somewhere in between these two parties. So this figure is just intended to illustrate this is a significant decision we have to make, how we're going to decide which edges are important and how we're going to extract the backbone. So we can walk through the process of extracting a backbone in the context of a bipartite projection. And I've got it in math language on the left and in the political context on the right, so we can sort of unpack this. So our goal is we're starting with a projection P of some bipartite graph B. In this case, we've got co-sponsorships from Senate bill sponsorships. And we're interested in deciding whether a given edge is significant. So we're going to consider a specific observed edge weight, Pij. In our example, we've been looking at the fact that Booker and Warren co-sponsored together 98 times. Is that significant? Should we retain that as an edge in the backbone? So the way we're going to make that decision is by comparing that observed edge weight to the distribution of its weight in a bunch of random projections. So, in some other worlds, they may have co-sponsored 91 times or 92 times or 105 times. So we're going to get a distribution of the number of times they might have co-sponsored under other scenarios. And we're going to form these random projections by projecting random bipartite networks that are drawn from an ensemble. So in a random bipartite network, maybe Booker in fact did sponsor Senate Bill 498, but didn't sponsor Senate Bill 862. These represent other scenarios. So once we've got our distribution of the edge weight in projections arising from a bunch of random projections, then we can simply find the probability that our observed edge weight was bigger than this distribution of a bunch of random potential edge weights. So in our context, we might observe, for instance, of all possible bill sponsorships, that is, of all possible bipartite graphs, there's only a 1% chance that Booker and Warren would have co-sponsored more than 98 times. And so at that point, we can proceed using an ordinary hypothesis test, treating this probability as a p-value. So if the p-value associated with this edge is less than alpha, some significance threshold we're using, we'll keep Pij in the backbone. In our example, we might observe co-sponsoring 98 times for this pair of senators is unusually high given what it could have been. And so we retain the edge between Booker and Warren in our backbone, and we maybe treat this as indicating that they are political allies. So the spot where this process sort of diverges and where the notion of hard and soft constraints comes in is how we define this ensemble, how it is that we generate these random bipartite networks that we're interested in. So one possibility is we impose hard constraints. That is, each B star, each random bipartite network that we use has degree sequences that exactly match our observed bipartite. So this would be equivalent to saying in every possible world, Booker always sponsored exactly 261 bills. The other possibility is we impose soft constraints. So in the soft constraint, we're still constraining the degree sequences of each of these random bipartite graphs, but we only require that they match our observed on average. So this would be equivalent in all possible worlds, Booker sponsors on average 261 bills, but in some possible worlds, he sponsors a few more, in some possible worlds, a few less. And so these are really the two backbone extraction processes that I'll be comparing. What does it look like if we impose hard constraints on these random bipartite graphs versus soft constraints? So we can make a few direct comparisons right off the bat. One of the things that's incredibly confusing in this literature is that these models go by many different names depending on which literature you're in. So in some cases, the hard constraint version is described as a microcanonical ensemble. In some cases, it's described as the fixed degree sequence model. In the rest of the talk, because it's what it's called in the backbone package, I'll be calling it FDSM. The soft constraint version, sometimes called a canonical ensemble or the stochastic degree sequence model, or SDSM. So the real key to making either of these backbone extraction models work is we need to find the distribution of P star ij. So that's the distribution of edge weights between I and j in this ensemble or in this set of random bipartite networks. So the challenge, one of the key challenges when we impose hard constraints is the distribution of P star ij is unknown. And so we have to use Monte Carlo procedures to simulate it. We need to build this distribution empirically. The big advantage to soft constraints is the distribution is known. It's distributed Poisson binomial. And you'll see in a few minutes that makes it significantly faster. So the other challenge is so once we have these P star ij distributions, we can use them to compute each edge's P value. These P values are the extent to which the observed edge weight is unusual compared to what it could have been. When we're computing the edge's P value under hard constraints, this is merely approximate. So the more Monte Carlo trials we run, the more precision we get in these P values. Whereas in the soft constraint model, we can compute edge's P values exactly. And we'll see in a minute how that comes into play also. So the challenge then, of course, is when we're extracting a backbone, we're left with this choice. Should I extract it imposing hard constraints or soft constraints? So one of the advantages, and this is my primary work in this area, is implementing some of these methods in R. So all of these methods are automated by the R backbone package. So if you're an R user, getting it started pretty straightforward. We can install it from CRAN, load it up. We get some citations, some help tools. It's got a vignette that walks us through. And the syntax is actually quite straightforward for extracting a backbone using the package. So we start with some sort of data object, in this case, X. So X could be an incidence matrix, it could be an edge list, could be an iGraph object, something containing our bipartite network. Then we can pick one of these two functions. So FDSM is the model that imposes hard constraints, SDSM, the model that imposes soft constraints, and gives us our backbone. So in this case, BB, our backbone, is going to be a unipartite graph, and it's going to come back to us in whatever form X was. So if our starting data was a matrix, an incidence matrix, BB is going to give it to us as an adjacency matrix. If X was a bipartite iGraph, BB is going to be a unipartite iGraph. So one of the things I've been working on building into this package is this narrative parameter. So if we add narrative equals true to any of the commands in the package, it also helps us write our paper. So it gives us this narrative text and some citations that we can simply drop in. Tells us how big our network was, what we actually did, what kind of thing we extracted, at what level of significance. And so, I think that's sort of fairly helpful for, helping people understand exactly what the software is doing. So we can turn then to a couple comparisons. What difference does it make if we choose hard constraints versus soft constraints? So one of the biggest differences is speed. Because hard constraints require Monte Carlo resampling to build these distributions, it's very slow. We can see in this graph, FDSM is about 1,000 times slower. SDSM is about 1,000 times faster than FDSM. So just to contextualize that, if we start with a 250 by 250 node bipartite network, extracting the backbone using SDSM somewhere around a half second, extracting it using FDSM almost 500 seconds. So there's a dramatic speed difference, and this is not a particularly large bipartite network. So for large networks, FDSM becomes almost computationally impractical. SDSM may be our only choice here. The next dimension we might compare them on is something like statistical power. Are we able to detect edges that are significant? So I'm switching gears a little bit to the geographical case from the political case. So in this case, these data come from the Globalization and World Cities group at Loughborough. So this comes from bipartite data measuring 100 firms and 315 cities. And they typically use these data to measure world city networks, where cities are connected if they share firms. And so in this context, we're focused on the case of, say, Milan and Paris. And we've observed that Milan and Paris share 26 of these firms. So there are 26 of these firms that maintain an office in Milan and an office in Paris. And the challenge for us is to decide, is that a significant number of co-locations? Does this provide us evidence that Milan and Paris have some sort of economic linkage or economic complementarity because they are serving as homes for many of the same firms? And we get slightly different answers if we use hard constraints or soft constraints. So the pink distribution here is the distribution of PIJ, the distribution of the Milan-Paris edge in a bunch of projections generated from bipartite graphs that had fixed row and column marginals. So according to FDSM, if we impose these hard constraints, 26 co-locations is very unusual. It's way out in the upper end of the tail. And so from the perspective of hard constraints, we would conclude this edge is significant. We should preserve an edge between Milan and Paris in our backbone. So the blue distribution is the distribution of PIJ if we impose soft constraints. So these are projections generated if Milan has on average the same number of firms, Paris has on average the same number of firms, and so on. And you can see that the SDSM distribution is a bit flatter, a bit wider. So according to SDSM, if we use soft constraints, 26 co-locations is not particularly unusual. It's not as far out in the tail of this distribution. And so if we used soft constraints, we would conclude the edge between Milan and Paris not statistically significant. We would not preserve it in the backbone. And so this is a second key difference between imposing hard and soft constraints. So under FDSM, if we impose hard constraints, we get much narrower distributions on these edge weights, which makes it easier to detect edges that are significant. Under SDSM, if we impose soft constraints, we get these flatter, wider distributions, which makes it a bit harder to detect edges that are significant. In practice, this makes hard constraint backbones a bit denser because we wind up preserving more edges, and soft constraint backbones a bit sparser because we wind up not including as many.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if you were simply to change the p-value that you use in order to keep the same density of edges for both models, do you have typically the same graphs, or do you observe differences?
It's almost like I've asked you to plant that question. So we'll get to that in about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay. But yes, that's exactly the right intuition for solving this issue when we're comparing the two. So yeah, we'll come back to that in just a minute.
Okay. I have a question here about the distribution. So it seems to me that they have different mean of these two distributions, like the expected value. Is it expected or it's just this case? And then the shade and the right shade.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the shape of the hard constraint distribution really depends on how many resamples we've taken. This one, I think I drew with 1,000 resamples, which is fairly low in this context. So I would anticipate their means should be fairly similar. If we drew many more resamples, we'd have distributions that had the same mean, but different variances. But that's not something we've directly investigated because it's so time consuming to build these hard constraint distributions. Building the soft constraint distributions is very fast. And so we know a lot about what they look like. We know very little about the shape of the distributions under the hard constraints.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so a third dimension that I've compared these on is their ability to recover community structures, modular networks. And so one way we can investigate this is by simulating some bipartite networks that either have a planted partition or don't, and check to see whether these backbones can recover that known planted partition, that known community structure. So this is an example of a bipartite network that has no planted partition. So in this case, each of these little black dots represents a 1 in an incidence matrix. So we can see we've got two types of agents, group A and group B. And we have to also have two types of artifacts, group A and group B. And in this example, type A agents have an equal probability of being associated with one of these group A artifacts or one of these group B artifacts. So there's no tendency for group A agents to associate with one or the other. The same is true of group B. So agents in group B have the same probability of associating with group A artifacts as group B artifacts. We can quantify this by measuring the fraction of within group edges. So 0.5, 50% of the edges are within groups. So A agents to A artifacts and A agents to B artifacts. So if we extract a backbone from these sort of bipartite data, we would expect no clustering at all. There's no partition that's been planted in the data. Now we can contrast this with a random bipartite network where we've shuffled the positions of the ones and zeros to plant a partition. So in this case, group A agents are associated mainly with group A artifacts. You can see much higher density here. Likewise, group B agents, much more likely to be associated with group B artifacts. So you can see much higher density here. And we can quantify that again as the fraction of within group edges. So we've got a density of 80% in these diagonal blocks. And so we would expect if we extract the backbone from this sort of data, it should be clustered. It should have a modular structure. And that's exactly what we see. So when there is no planted partition, when this fraction of within group edges is very low, we get low modularity values, whether we extract it using hard or soft constraints, no communities in the extracted networks. When the planted partition is strong, so when there's a high fraction of within group edges, then we start to see the modularity climb and we get very modular backbones. We can detect these planted community structures. And I think what's noteworthy here is that they both perform equally well. It doesn't matter if we use hard constraints or soft constraints. Both approaches seem to do an equally good job of detecting communities and preserving modular structures when we know they exist, and failing to detect modular structures when we know they in fact are not there. So they both work well there. So the last, and this is sort of the crux of the comparison, is asking, do they give us the same kind of backbone? Can we use hard and soft constraints interchangeably? And one of the things that might impact that is the distribution of degree sequences. So in a bipartite network, the degree sequences can have lots of different distributions. They could be normally distributed, left tail, right tail, uniform, constant. And so the question we've explored here is, under different degree sequence distributions, does FDSM with hard constraints and SDSM with soft constraints yield the same kinds of backbones? So there's a lot going on in this figure. I'll walk you through it piece by piece, and we can see what's going on here. So if we extract a backbone at the alpha 0.05 significance level, and if the bipartite we're extracting it from is such that the agent's degree is constant, so every agent had the same degree, all the row marginals are the same, and if the bipartite graph we're extracting it from, the artifact degree is constant, that is, all of the column sums are the same, then the backbone we get using FDSM, hard constraints, and the backbone we get from SDSM using soft constraints is very similar. And in this context, we're measuring similarity simply using the Jacquard coefficient. So they're essentially identical backbones in this very specific case. The problem is, in almost all other cases, if we have different sorts of marginal distributions, different degree distributions, the backbones we get using hard constraints and soft constraints look really different. They're completely separate. But, and this gets back to the question we had just a moment ago, we have to remember when we use soft constraints, it's a less statistically powerful model. It makes it harder to detect statistically significant edges. So one way we can make FDSM and SDSM more similar is by relaxing the alpha value we use when we're extracting it using the soft constraints. So in this case, if we use a slightly larger alpha value, So I'm still extracting the hard constraint backbone at a significance level of 0.05. But in this example, I'm using a slightly higher alpha, around 0.11, 0.12, to extract it using soft constraints. So we use a slightly larger alpha for the soft constraints. What we observe is for any agent degree distribution and for any artifact degree distribution, the FDSM hard constraint backbone and the SDSM soft constraint backbone are very similar. They're not identical, but they're quite similar, Jacquard similarities of above 0.9. And so what this suggests is that FDSM and SDSM are nearly equivalent, provided we pick alpha carefully. So if we pick a more liberal value of alpha for SDSM, we can achieve a backbone that looks very similar to a more conservative FDSM. So then we can come back to our comparison. So we've seen in terms of speed, the big challenge with imposing hard constraints is it is incredibly slow, and typically so slow as to be computationally infeasible for any reasonably sized empirical data. In contrast, imposing soft constraints incredibly fast, negligibly fast. In terms of statistical power, so the hard constraint model, slightly higher statistical power, lower statistical power for soft constraints, but we've seen how we can adjust that by using a slightly more liberal alpha significance level when we use soft constraints. They both do an outstanding job detecting communities when they exist, not detecting communities when they don't exist. And in terms of backbone similarity, they yield nearly identical outcomes as long as we pick this alpha significance level carefully. So then just sort of bringing that all together, wrapping up, I think bipartite projections can be really helpful, especially in contexts where we're interested in a unipartite network, but it would be really difficult to measure. As long as we have a theory about why the agents of interest have a relationship when they share these properties, then we can use bipartite projections as sort of an indirect way of measuring. But we need to be careful. We need a strategy for identifying significant edges. Backbone extraction gives us one of those strategies. It lets us, it gives us sort of a statistical framework for inferring a unipartite network from bipartite data. I've illustrated very briefly here how we can use the backbone package to automate that. And when we're thinking about the choice between hard constraints and soft constraints, in nearly all cases, hard constraints are going to be impractical. The advantage is that soft constraints, as long as we pick a somewhat more liberal alpha than we might normally, we can get nearly identical results in a tiny fraction of the time. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, for the invitation. I've got some citations to a couple related papers there, some of them tutorials walking through the functions of the backbone package, some of the algorithms that underlie that. But I'd appreciate any feedback you have on this work, on the package, any questions about these backbone extraction methods. And I think I'll stop there and maybe we can have a conversation.
So thanks for your interesting talk. Do we have any questions? Okay, Tim, please.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. This is really interesting. I'm thinking about speeding up the hard constraint model. And I'm wondering, when you're constructing these distributions on each of the edges, how independent or not independent are they? Is one distribution from the rest of the distributions? Because I guess if you're constraining the weight in some way, then somehow that must be incorporated in the distribution. But yeah, can they be computed basically independently, or do you need to compute or correct them all at once?
Right, that's a great question. And I think it gets at what makes this challenging is these distributions are completely non-independent. The advantage to the soft constraint approach is each distribution is independent. We can compute each one on its own. We could parallelize it, things like that. That doesn't work in the hard constraint model. We actually have to construct a bipartite network with the fixed row and column marginals, then do the matrix multiplication to get the projection, save the edge weights, and do it over again. And that's really the bottleneck. Yeah, I think what we would really need to really make it as fast as the soft constraint is some way of describing these distributions based on characteristics of the bipartite data. And at this point, we don't have that and don't really have any leads.
Yeah, and it seems like as soon as you start trying to do that, you just go to the soft constraint model. So
exactly, yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Yes, yes, please.
So this reminds me of a work by Sarocco and Squartini, or in the physics community. I don't know if you know them, and if you know if there are some connections with what you've been presenting today.
Connections between this work and the work in the physics community?
Yeah, by people like, I think that the authors are, first author was Sarocco, and Squartini, it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I think.
Yes, definitely. So in the physics literature, that's where we tend to see hard and soft constraints described as canonical versus microcanonical ensembles. The physics literature is where we get the bipartite configuration model, which is, at least at present, the fastest way of generating the probabilities we need to compute the Poisson binomial, which are the distributions used in the soft constraint model. So this is definitely drawing on some innovations from physics, some innovations from math, some innovations from social science. It's really pulling in from a lot of different disciplines. I think one of the challenges in moving this backbone literature forward is that each of those disciplines uses different language for each of these objects. And so it's sometimes difficult to tell if they're in fact doing the same thing using different terms. But definitely the soft constraint model is moving forward, pulling on some of the work, certainly Sarocco and Squartini's innovations on the bipartite configuration model has been key.
And I was also wondering, because the method, this is a fairly old one, where the thresholding is done by transforming the adjacency matrix into a doubly stochastic matrix, and then using a filter on that. It's a method by Slater from the 70s, I think, or 80s. I don't know if you have used it, and if you have some insight on the benefits or maybe limitations of that method.
Sorry, the audio isn't so good. I caught something about adjacency matrix at the beginning, but I think maybe because you're in the back of the room.
Yeah, sorry. So I was asking about, so there's an old method by Slater, I think it was in the 70s, 80s, where he was filtering weighted matrices by first transforming the matrix into a doubly stochastic matrix, so that each of the row and lines would be normalized to 1. And then we would be doing the thresholding. And I was just wondering if you had some insight on the possible benefits or limitations of that method.
Right. Yeah, I've seen, I'm not sure if I've seen the particular model you're describing, but there's certainly an astonishingly large number of models, and many of them begin by sort of transforming or normalizing the weights in the initially weighted matrix. I think one of the challenges, and that's where most of the innovation in network backbone extraction has been, is given a weighted adjacency matrix, how can we transform or normalize or generate some sort of null model that gives us some insight? I think where some of this work differs is that it doesn't operate on the weighted projection matrix. It actually operates on the original bipartite matrix. Because in the case of bipartite projections, if we focus on the weighted projection, we've already lost some of the critical information. In the politics case, we've already lost the information about whether the bills were popular or unpopular, which is significant in deciding whether co-sponsorships are large or small. And so I think the key feature that distinguishes the bulk of the backbone literature from the literature on backbones of bipartite projections is developing null models that operate on the original incidence matrix before it's been projected. That's one of the things that makes it a bit more complicated, a bit slower, but perhaps better suited for bipartite projections.
Thanks for that. Please.
Yeah, another question was wondering, since you're doing this kind of in a social science, political science context, at least for some of these systems, have you tried like more human validation of these significance thresholds to see, like, is there a relationship between choosing kind of the arbitrary standard like 0.05 And are you systematically destroying relationships that you think that maybe someone observing outside would say, no, that relationship should be there, or the opposite? Yeah, has there been any kind of human in the loop evaluation of the backboning?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is no. So most of the work on validation is using simulated data because we can control its characteristics. The challenge, I think, in empirically validating these is we need to identify contexts where we have an empirical bipartite network and a completely independently measured but known to be valid unipartite network of the same people. And we've been struggling to identify contexts where both of those pieces of information exist. That's one of the things that leads us to stick with, my background is not particularly in political science, but these Congress data work nicely because at least we know that US Congress is hopelessly polarized. And so the closer we can match that, that sort of two cluster structure, it gives us some sort of ground truth to aim for. But yeah, one of the struggles in sort of doing the empirical validation is finding cases where we have both the bipartite and the unipartite, and they were independently measured. So absolutely, any thoughts on where we might locate that kind of data would be most welcome.
Yeah, the only one I can think of is too trivial, I think, because it would be like email communication, but then you automatically have the same projection. So you could measure it independently, but it would be measuring from the same exact data that you're measuring the bipartite from. So yeah,
yeah, and the one other context, but it's a trivially small data, but many of you are probably familiar with the Southern women data. So 14 women attending 18 events in the US South in the 30s. And so we have data about their event attendance from the social column of the newspaper. But independently, each of the women was interviewed about who their friends were and who they didn't like in this social group. So we can definitely reproduce the interview results from the backbones. Mm-hmm. The challenge is the network is so small that to get anything, we need to use sort of ridiculously large alphas of like 0.2, 0.25, because it's just underpowered. There's not enough data there. But that's the one other case where we got a tiny data set, but we have both the bipartite and the unipartite.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, I just had a question about the constraints. If are they only on the degree of the agent, or do you also have a way to constrain the degree of the artifact?
So in the two models I've talked about here, they're constraining both of them simultaneously. Oh. So the hard constraints fix them exactly. The soft constraints fix both on average. In the first paper on screen, the scientific reports paper, we actually compare several other models to the hard constraint model. So it's possible to exactly compute p-values. The distributions are known if we only fix the row degrees, but we fix them exactly, or if we only fix the column degrees and we fix them exactly, or if we only fix the total fill rate, but we fix it exactly. So we can impose partial hard constraints, and those are very fast and easy also. It's just in the case where we impose double hard constraints on the row marginals and the column marginals at the same time. That's where we get this problem of non-independence that makes it really tricky. But yeah, definitely in the two models I've talked about, both rows and columns are fixed simultaneously.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Do we have other questions? I have one interesting question. Could you please go back to the R package page with the narrative commands? I saw something to sign. Yeah. So how do you get the sign backlog?
Yeah, great question. So in everything I've talked about here, we've been focusing on identifying edges whose weight in the projection is significantly stronger than we would expect in our null model. And the null model is defined by these hard and soft constraints. But we can use the same logic, and this is in the backbone package as well, to test not only are they larger than we would expect under the null model, but also if they're smaller. And we can extract a signed backbone treating edge weights that are smaller than expected as negative edges. And this is something that we've been working on in the political context. So if we extract the signed backbone, we'd expect the sort of network like I showed, positive edges among Democrats and among Republicans, and then negative edges between the two. And so we certainly can reproduce that. We get networks with very high levels of structural balance. So it's a kind of extension to these backbone models that allow us to extract sort of unsigned binary unipartite networks or signed networks.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Yeah, thanks. So I don't see any questions from the room and also from online. I guess that's the end of our seminar. So thanks for the talk.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it. If any of you have questions or suggestions about the package, please feel free to follow up, and especially if you have data for validation, get in touch.
Yeah, thanks. See you next week.
If you